Hey, how's it going? My name is Gabby. Welcome back to my channel, and today I'm going to be discussing the top 10 Goodreads horror books choices of the year. Because when the top 10 horror nominations just got announced the other day, I realized that I had already read 8 out of the 10 nominations, so of course I took it upon myself to read the remaining 2 books that I had not yet read so that I could make a video discussing the top 10 horror nominations and what I think of them. And not gonna lie, I'm a little upset with this top 10, okay? These were not the books that I would have chosen to be in my top 10. But before we get into the books, I just wanted to say a huge thank you to Bright Cellars for sponsoring today's video, because nothing pairs better with horror books than wine. Am I correct? I think so. Bright Cellars is a wine company who I've been working with for a little while now, and they're a wine company that I absolutely love because they match you to different wines all over the world that are curated to your specific palate. All you need to do is take their quick and simple 7-question quiz so that they can gather your taste preferences and deliver you wines that you're guaranteed to like. It's very convenient, you know, because they just deliver the wines straight to your door. You don't even have to leave your house. You don't have to spend hours browsing the liquor store trying to figure out what you might like. Wine can be expensive, you know. It really sucks when you spend a bunch of money on a bottle that you don't even enjoy. And that's why it's so great to have them do the work for you and send you bottles that you know you're gonna like. Something that makes Bright Cellars especially cool is the fact that they send these little wine education cards that come with every bottle you order. And on the back of these cards, it has tons of useful information, like what are the main flavors that are in the bottle, what temperature the bottle should be served at, what it pairs well with, and where it comes from. I've noticed that a lot of my favorite wines all come from California, which is not too much of a surprise because I am also from California. And I've noticed a lot of my favorite wines have peach as one of the main flavors in there. I definitely like the sweeter wines. One of the new bottles that I got sent this month that I've never tried before is this Forever Fleeting one. I just took a sample of it last night and I really enjoy the flavor. This one's really sweet, and I'm kind of obsessed with this label, to be honest. Like, I kind of just want to put this on a bulletin board or something because it's so beautiful. And then they did also once again send me 2 of my favorites. Like, these are probably my 2 favorite wines that I've received from Bright Cellars, and I'm so glad that I discovered them because of Bright Cellars, because it's Meet Cute and Dreamlet. Like, oh my god, these 2 are freaking phenomenal. Sponsors on my channel make it possible for me to continue to create the content that I do create, and so by supporting a sponsor, you can directly be supporting this channel. And Bright Cellars is offering 60% off your first 4 bottle box. So that's 4 bottles for just $38, which is crazy good value. Yeah, make sure to use the link in my description and go and take the quiz and get started with your Bright Cellars journey. And thank you so much once again to Bright Cellars for sponsoring today's video. And now let's get into the horror books. So for this horror category, the first thing that I want to mention is that I'm pretty upset about the fact that 2 of my favorite horror books of the year that were in the top 20 did not make it to the top 10, because Near the Bone by Christina Henry is probably my favorite horror book that I read this year out of all of the top 20, and I'm really upset that this didn't even make it into the top 10. Like, I'm actually kind of offended about it. And then When the Reckoning Comes is a book that I also just recently read because I assumed that this would easily make it into the top 10 because it's freaking phenomenal, but no, this one didn't make it into the top 10 either. I'm kind of mad about it, honestly. Like, I feel like these 2 would be my picks. Like, I'd be struggling between which one to pick for my favorite, and yet somehow they're not even in the top 10. So the top 10, what are they? What are my thoughts on them? The first book that made into the top 10 is Later by Stephen King, which, you know, of course it did because it's Stephen King. And even though this book is considered a hard case crime kind of book, somehow it made it into horror. Like, I know I was saying in my reaction video that I personally would not consider this to be horror, and then I got a lot of comments saying that this book is horror though because there's some like supernatural elements in this book, and like, I guess, like, I can see how it made it into the horror genre, but I still would personally not classify this as horror, and I feel like that's gonna be the case with a few of these books in this video that I'm gonna mention that I just don't think belong in the horror genre. Like, if it were up to me, some of these books would not be in this category at all. But in this book, we're following this young boy named Jamie who is born with these like supernatural abilities, and his mom is telling him to keep his abilities a secret. And just from that premise alone, this book does sound like it would fit into the horror genre, but most of this story ends up being about how this NYPD detective draws him into the pursuit of a killer, and the detective is just kind of using him to help solve cases and things like that. So it kind of feels more like on the crime thriller side of things and less on the horror side of things, at least for me, because I mean, while this book does have some supernatural elements to it for sure, it doesn't necessarily feel like horror, you know, because there's nothing in this book that's like truly scary, at least in my opinion. You might be hearing this and thinking that I didn't enjoy this book, when I did enjoy this book. I ended up giving this one like I think a 4 out of 5 stars. I was not a huge fan of the ending. If you've read this book, you probably know there's like this weird twist at the ending that's just so unnecessary and very strange and bizarre, and I don't know why Stephen King does these things. But yeah, this book was alright. It wasn't bad. It just doesn't belong in the horror category in my mind. I would much rather put this, I'd be happier if it was even in like the thriller mystery category, because it does feel more of like a crime thriller to me. Yeah, I actually did an entire reading vlog just dedicated to this book earlier this year, so if you want to see more of my thoughts, I'll have it linked down below. The next book in the top 10 is going to be All's Well by Mona Awad, and this is another one that I do struggle with putting this one in the horror category, but I'm not as mad about it because Mona Awad previously wrote Bunny, which was one of my favorite books that I read last year. And I still think about Bunny like constantly. Like that book is just always on my mind because it's one of the most bizarre, amazing books that I've ever read. And so I had some pretty high expectations going into All's Well earlier this year. And this book ended up being just okay for me. Like this one's like a 3 out of 5. It's like somewhere in the middle. And it's mostly because I felt a lot of confusion while reading this, and like not in a fun way. Because I do know like a lot of my all-time favorite books are books that would probably make people confused while they read it. But this was confusing in a way that wasn't a fun experience. But in this book, we're following this woman named Miranda who teaches this theater class, and she suffers from some pretty intense chronic pain. And I think the most horrific and horrifying thing about this book is the fact that she just continues to suffer through this pain, and nobody really believes her. Like they don't believe it's as bad as she says it is. Like none of her doctors believe her. Like there's nobody in her life that understands the kind of pain that she's in. And I think that that's absolutely terrifying, you know? Like that would be the worst thing in the world, to be experiencing so much pain and nobody really believes you, or they think you're just being like dramatic and over the top, or that you want attention. Like that would be awful. And so that's definitely the most horrifying thing happening in this book. But I do think this book, it does have this balance of like some really gorgeous writing that I just immediately connected with and was drawn into. But then by the ending of this book, it got really confusing, to be honest, and the writing just started going in places where I didn't understand what was even happening, and it just kind of lost me in the last 100 pages, you know? And that's what really sucks, is that this book started off feeling like it could be a 5-star book for me. Like I really loved the first like 200 or so pages of this, and I just felt so much for Miranda as a main character. Like she's actually one of the characters that stands out in my mind the most out of all the books that I've read this year. But unfortunately the ending just wasn't my favorite. I felt like this book was going in a certain direction that I was really enjoying, but then I feel like by the end it just kind of dropped the ball on where I thought it was going to be going, and I thought it could be really cool, you know? Especially in the beginning of this book, it was giving me major Joker vibes, and I don't know if it was just because of this cover or like what, but like the way that we neglect people in society that need help the most, I feel like that's the vibe that was giving me Joker vibes in this. And yeah, this book ended up being fine. It's a 3 out of 5. I'm not that mad that it's in the horror category, but I also don't think this is horror. It's more just like a magical realism with some darker themes, kind of. I am bad at explaining books. Alright, the third book on this list is A Dowry of Blood by S.T. Gibson, and I'm actually so excited about this one because this is one of the books that I had to read in order to film this video. This is one of the 2 books that I have not yet read and hadn't even heard of, to be honest. And this book was such an amazing surprise, because this book, we're following like the Bride of Dracula. It's kind of like a reimagining, but instead it's gay. The book is like written in this very strange like second person kind of writing style, because it's almost like she's writing to you, like you are Dracula. And I thought the writing in this book was just absolutely gorgeous. Like I was obsessed with the way that this book was written. It's also actually very short. It's like only like 200 pages on an e-reader or so, so it's a very short, quick and easy book to get through, and the writing is just gorgeous. Like the writing is everything. And honestly, I tend to not read a lot of horror that involves vampires. I mean, I know I say that as I'm wearing a Salem's Lot shirt, but honestly, vampires in horror are one of the things that make me a little like squeamish when it comes to reading horror books, because anything with like blood and like sucking blood, like anything blood related, I'm like, whew, yeah, I get a little squeamish, I get a little queasy. And so there were some scenes in this book that I was like seriously disturbed. But also, I love that this book involves as much romance as it does. Like, this was kind of a lovely surprise. Usually with romance and horror, I don't like for them to mix, because I feel like it's never done in a way that I like, or it focuses on one, or it focuses too much on the romance and not enough on the horror, or like vice versa. But in this book, I loved the balance of the romance and the horror. I was like so here for the romance happening in this book, you know, because it was just so well written. So yeah, this book was kind of everything. I'm still unsure if I'm gonna end up giving this one 4 or 5 stars, but this one definitely surprised the hell out of me. It's gonna end up being one of my favorites. The next book on this list is going to be The Book of Accidents by Chuck Wendig, and this is one of my favorite horror novels of this year. I am so happy to see this book on this list. And I was really surprised, to be honest, to love this book as much as I did, because I did read Wanderers, this author's previous book, last year, I think, and that book ended up being a DNF for me at like 500 pages into it. I just really did not enjoy that one. So I went into this one kind of skeptical, you know, I was like, I don't know if this is gonna be my thing or not, but holy shit, this one was so good. This one just had the best, like, spooky atmosphere, like a small town, like something's going on in this small town and it's like haunted or something. And in this book, we're following this man named Nathan who grew up in this house where his father was like very abusive towards him. Now he has his own son and his wife, and his father has just passed away, and his father left him the house that he grew up in, and so his family's going to be going and moving back into the house where he grew up. And there's just something going on in the town. Like, the town, it's just very haunted, like there's something going on. The neighbor's kind of strange, and this book is kind of a lengthy one, to be honest. Like, it is pretty chunky. It's like over 500 pages, and it's not only horror, but this one also has a touch of another genre as well in it, which is also really cool and really unexpected. But I just loved this so much. I loved the writing. It was just so eerie and so spooky. There were some scenes that took place on Halloween night that really stand out in my brain. Prologue of this book involves this serial killer from back in the day, and he kind of plays a part in this story. And then there's their son Oliver makes friends with this young boy who has these like weird things going on with him, and there's just so much in this book that I love about it. This book also gave me major The Shining vibes, like Stephen King The Shining, because of the whole, you know, like scary abusive dad kind of thing happening in this book. Yeah, really loved this one. I'm so happy to see that this book is on the list, and this might be a contender for the book that I vote for. This one ended up being like a 4/4.5 out of 5 for me. And then the next book on this list is going to be The Final Girl Support Group by Grady Hendrix. This is one that is probably my most like controversial, different opinion on this list, because I was not a fan of this book. I actually DNF'd this book about 50% of the way through it. And like, that was a major bummer for me, you know, because I'm a huge fan of Grady Hendrix. This is like my 3rd or 4th book from Grady Hendrix now, and I just wanted to love it so desperately. But I think something that I've figured out about my specific taste in horror this year is that I'm not a huge fan of slashers. Like, I don't know what it is. Like, I love slashers in movies for the most part, but there's something about reading slashers that just doesn't translate very well to text, because I just find them so repetitive and boring. And in this book, we're following this group of women who are all the final girls of their own, like, you know, disasters that happened to them. They were all involved in these like mass murders where all of their friends and everyone who was with them died, and they were the only final girl who survived it. And now they're a part of this final girl support group where they all kind of get together and they can talk about their experiences and things like that. But then members of their final girl support group start getting hunted and killed, and so one by one they start feeling like this stress, like somebody's after them. I don't know what it is about this book, but I just didn't connect with any of the characters. I actually thought it was really slow, and it was dragging a lot for how, you know, action-packed this book was supposed to feel. It just felt like a lot of the action was kind of boring to read, to be honest. Like, I don't know, I didn't connect with this book at all. Like, there was nothing about it that made me want to continue reading it and finish reading it. But also, like, I just didn't care enough, you know, and I wish that I cared, but I didn't. And so this one, I DNF'd it. I didn't end up rating this one. It was just not my jam. And then the next book on this list is Cackle by Rachel Harrison. This is another book that, you know, I just read this one in October, and even though this one, it can be considered horror in some ways, I do think this one kind of feels weird being in the horror genre, you know, because this one kind of feels more like contemporary in a way, with like a touch of some weird witchy horror stuff happening on the side. But in this book, we're following this woman who has just recently dealt with this 10-year breakup. Like, her and her boyfriend, or her fiance, I can't remember, but they were together for like 10 years, and now they've broken up, he's moving on, and it's just it's been really hard on her. And a lot of her character development and her journey as a character is about her recovering from this 10-year relationship. In this book, she ends up moving from Manhattan, New York to like upstate New York, York, and she goes and moves to this small little village town, and in this town there's this woman there that she becomes friends with that's like a little bit older than her, and this woman in the town is just very mysterious, you know, because she has this like mansion that's like out in the middle of nowhere, and she just has these like random things that just don't really make sense. And yeah, it's kind of about her becoming friends with her, figuring out what's going on with her, and because of that woman, she's like the one aspect in this book that's kind of horror vibes. But otherwise, I feel like this book is pretty tame. It feels like mostly like a contemporary story of this woman trying to recover from this relationship that she was in. I don't know, I mean, there were a few good scenes in this book that involved spiders that really triggered me, because spiders are one of the things that like I don't fuck with spiders, okay? Like spiders are scary. And so that was definitely like the scariest aspect of this book for me, is the discussion about spiders, and like any of those scenes that had the spiders, I was like, no. So it was definitely a little uncomfy at times to read this one because of the spiders, but otherwise I feel like this story was pretty tame. And I don't know, by the ending I just felt pretty meh about it. Like I ended up giving this one 3 stars. I didn't hate it, but it's also just not very memorable for me. Alright, and the next book on this list is My Heart is a Chainsaw by Stephen Graham Jones, and this is a book that I was super looking forward to because I've read 2 other books by Stephen Graham Jones now. I've read The Only Good Indians and Night of the Mannequins. One of his books, one of those was a 3 stars for me, but the other one was a 5-star book for me. And so I was pretty disappointed by the fact that I didn't end up enjoying this one very much. I actually ended up DNFing this book too at like 200 or 250 pages into it, so I was pretty far into it. But also this book is pretty long. It's like 400 pages or even more than that. And this book, I wanted to love it so bad, you know, but I just couldn't connect with this story, like, or with the main character. I think something that's really great about this, though, is that it starts off with a bang. Like, the opening scene in this book is just so cool. It immediately, like, sucks you right in. But then we just start to go on this journey with this main character, Jade, as she starts to feel like she is the protagonist in a slasher movie. And, you know, once again, maybe this is my thing with, like, not liking slashers very much, but I just immediately became a lot less interested in this story after the first opening chapter, and I just felt like this story dragged so much. I feel like I have the same feelings about this author as I do with Josh Malerman, is the fact that I think this author really thrives in the short story format, but for me, their full-length novels just feel like they drag on and they're just so boring. And I feel like the same exact way about Josh Malerman, because he's like mostly the same way, is that his full-length novels are just like way too long, like they need to be cut down, and then his short stories end up being some of my favorites, you know? So it's like, I don't know, I really wanted to love this, but unfortunately it just wasn't my thing. It just did not end up being my jam. And then the next book on this list is The Drowning Kind by Jennifer McMahon, my freaking queen. I'm so happy to see Jennifer McMahon on this list, like you don't even know. This was actually the second Jennifer McMahon book that I had ever read. I read this earlier this year in like April, and before this I had read The Winter People, and like, oh my god, The Winter People has become one of my like all-time favorite horror books, and so I was super stoked, hyped to read this one. And this one is like historical fiction horror, and something that I think Jennifer McMahon does really well in all of her books is she has like 2 timelines going back and forth. So yeah, in this book we're pretty much jumping back and forth between like 1929 and then 2019, and both of these timelines involve this water in this book. That's like this water that's kind of like magical. Sorry, I'm like trying to read the premise because I'm trying to figure out what it actually tells you before you read the book, because I don't want to spoil anything. Okay, so after reading the description, I know that I can tell you that in the past chapters we're following this couple who is desperately wanting this baby, and so the husband takes her up to this natural spring where it's rumored that the water grants people wishes. And then in the present day in 2019, we're following these 2 sisters, and one of the sisters finds out that her older sister just died in a swimming accident in the pool, like she drowned in the pool. And so she goes back to the house where they grew up, where her sister just drowned, and she found out that her sister was like researching the history of the house and this water and all this stuff. And the way that Jennifer McMahon is able to connect the 2, you know, timelines, it's just incredible. Like, I love the way she writes. I love that she always has like sister relationships at the center of her horror novels, because oh my god, it's just so freaking good. It's just so good. And this one had some really like genuinely creepy moments of like feeling like there's something in the water. I don't know about you, but water water really freaks me out. Like, the idea of something being underneath you in the water and you not knowing about it is one of the things that terrifies me the most in this world. And like the idea of being able to hear like wet footprints behind you and then like nothing's there, it's just those kinds of things really scare me. And so for that reason, this book was pretty creepy. Okay, it did the job, it did the thing. So yeah, this one ended up being like a 4.5 out of 5 for me. Like, honestly, talking about it now just makes me want to round it up and give that freaking 5. And then the next book on this list is Summer Suns, and this is also one of the 2 books that I had to read for this video. So I wasn't really originally planning on reading this one, but unfortunately, this one just ended up being not my thing, and that's for like a number of reasons. I actually ended up DNFing this book about 50% of the way through it because I just could not connect to these characters at all. And so in this book, we're following these 2 boys, Andrew and Eddie, and they were best friends that did everything together. And then Eddie randomly dies of a supposed suicide. And so now Andrew has taken it upon himself to like go down to Nashville where Eddie was and try to figure out what actually happened, like what was the truth, and he uncovers all of these like secrets and lies about his life that he never knew. And this book, it has an interesting-ish premise. I mean, I don't know if I would personally pick up this book myself, but it does have an interesting enough premise. But also, this is one that I would not categorize this as a horror book, because this book is pitched as a Southern Gothic queer horror novel. And I just don't really get that from this. Like, I would personally consider this more of like a Southern Gothic queer mystery story, maybe. But as far as the horror goes, like, it never really felt like a horror novel to me. And it honestly just felt a little bit more like on the dramatic side at times, as opposed to like the creepy, sinister kind of vibes that you expect from horror books. I also feel like this book is just way too repetitive, and it's about a lot of things that I just really didn't care about. Like, these characters are really into like cars and car races, and there's a lot of like Fast and Furious kind of like races going down in this book, and I don't care about cars. Like, I'm not a car person. I could care less about car races. There's also a lot of fighting between a lot of young boys. They're just always fighting, like getting into fights, like bloody noses, and it was so boring. Like, every time there was like a fight scene, I would just kind of like, my brain would just not focus, and there would just be like noise in the background of me listening to the audiobook because like I could not care less. I don't know, there was just nothing about this book that I vibed with. I just didn't really like the characters very much, and like while I did feel sympathy for the situation that the main character was in, it was just kind of hard to root for him at the same time because of the situations that he would put himself into. And you know, as I said, like while the book wasn't exactly like slow, it was just kind of boring for me personally because I wasn't really interested in anything that was happening, and it was so repetitive. I just couldn't do it anymore. I had to DNF it 50% in because I was just like, I don't care. Then the 10th book on this list is The Last House on Needless Street by Catriona Ward, and this one was actually one of my book club selections for this year. If you didn't know, I have a book club called the Booktube that I have on this channel. That's kind of like a thriller, horror book club where we read a book together once a month and then discuss it on my channel. And so I actually have an entire live show discussing all of my thoughts on this book that I can link down below. But this is once again another book that I struggle with calling this a horror novel. I feel like if anything, this one feels more like a psychological thriller kind of story to me. And this book, I find that it's very hard to talk about this book without any spoilers, and so that's why I kind of struggle to even give you like a basic premise of this book. But in this story, we're just following this man named Ted, and he has this tween daughter named Lauren that lives in the house with him, and she like never leaves the house. And then we also get the point of view of his cat, Olivia, in this book, and the cat is very religious. And there's this whole thing that happened in their town a few years ago where this young little popsicle girl went missing, and Ted was kind of accused of like, he was a possible suspect, I guess, and people thought that he was responsible for this little girl going missing. And so in some alternate chapters, we do get the point of view of the little girl's older sister, Dee, as she's trying to figure out what actually happened to her sister, and she's also kind of suspecting that Ted was involved. So for those reasons, this definitely feels like more of like a thriller to me, and like a psychological thriller as opposed to a horror, because while there are horrific things that do happen in this book, the tone of it just feels more like a thriller to me for most of the story, especially because there's a really wild plot twist towards the end of this book. But I mean, with that being said, I still, you know, I really enjoyed this book for the most part. Like, this one ended up being a 4-star book for me. I think this book is really self-aware, and I really appreciate the author's note in this book. And yeah, I mean, it's, again, as I said, it's hard to talk about this book without spoiling anything, so if you would like to know more about it, I would highly recommend checking out the live show that I did discussing all of my thoughts on this book. So yeah, those are all of the 10 best books of the year for horror according to Goodreads. I would love to know if you agree or disagree with this list of 10 books. I mean, I know that Goodreads is not accurate, okay? I know it's basically like a popularity contest because it's not really like the best 10 books of the year, it's like the most popular books of the year in that genre. But what's hard for me about this category is the fact that I feel like a lot of these books don't even really fit into the horror category, so I think that's what makes me the most frustrated with Goodreads. I also think this year it's kind of strange that they took out the option for write-ins, because I feel like the write-ins at least gives us the opportunity to put on some of our favorites and see if they can make it into the top 10, but this time they just completely cut out the middle voting round, you know, so we only pretty much got, you know, we went from the top 20 to the top 10. so yeah, let me know your thoughts. Let me know which book you would be voting for this year out of these top 10. I mean, as I said, I personally would have been voting for Near the Bone or When the Reckoning Comes if they had made it. But I guess out of these top 10, it is hard to say, but I feel like my vote would actually go to either A Dowry of Blood, The Drowning Kind, or The Book of Accidents. I feel like these three were like the most solid horror books on this list that I read this year, because honestly everything else was pretty much a disappointment. So let me know your thoughts if you were able to read any of these books this year. Do you agree that they should be on this list, or are there any upsets for you that you feel like books that should have been in this top 10 that didn't make it into the top 10 that you think it's super frustrating? And before I go, I would love to know if you would like for me to do this with the top 10 romance books of the year as well, because I just noticed that I've read 8 out of the 10 romance books as well, and so I would only have 2 books to read for that video as well. So let me know if that's a video that you would like to see from me. And yeah, thank you so much for watching. Thanks for hanging out. Let me know what was the best horror book that you read in the year of 2021, and I will see you very soon with another video. Bye.